Hi everybody, this is Jeremy Siskind here. I've got two fantastic books playing solo jazz piano fundamentals. Also, want to encourage you to listen to my new CD, Songs Rebirth. I don't want your money, I just want your ears. Check it out, let me know what you think. And today's subject is sus chords. I think there's a lot of confusion out there about sus chords, exactly what they are, what they do. So we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive and see what they're about. So before we get into sus chords, I want to show you why it's called a sus chord. And so this is kind of a classic thing that you might learn if you take a music theory class, that a suspension is a device where you hold over a note from a previous chord that becomes a dissonance in a new chord. And there's three parts to a suspension, and I've written kind of the classic suspension here, which would be, so we have like a 5-7 chord in the key of C. And then this is called a 4-3 suspension because the fourth is suspended over. It's been prepared in this G7 as the seventh. And then it replaces the third for the first two beats of this measure, and then it resolves, right? This is the classic like amen cadence. And when we see the word sus in jazz, we are actually kind of assuming this note, this fourth, replacing the third. You'll see in other styles, particularly pop music, occasionally in like jazz rock, you'll see a sus2. But in jazz, when you see the word sus, or the letters sus, the abbreviation sus, you're assuming that the fourth is replacing the third. That is at the heart of a suspension. Now, you could have potentially two different sevenths when you have a suspension. So the most common thing is that you're going to have a sus7, or you'll see it written some different ways. I wrote some other ones here, C7 sus, or C7 sus4. All these are possible. If it's not clear from my bad writing, this is a flat over here. And so this would have, it's like a dominant seventh with, again, this word sus is meaning that the fourth replaces the third. So instead of your normal dominant chord, this is your dominant chord now. Now, it is possible to have this chord on the right, but it's a little bit less likely. So this is a C sus major 7. Okay, and you're just going to follow the directions. When it says sus, you know the fourth replaces the third. When it says triangle 7, you know that it's going to be a major 7th. This is usually kind of a classical sounding chord, and it's got this tritone in it between the F and the B, and that's an interval that really needs to resolve. So what's weird is that this doesn't really resolve very well to C major 7 because both the F and the C of the tritone want to pull out. That's not very satisfying, right? Because the tritone's not resolving. We could resolve it to a triad instead, okay? So you can see why it sounds very classical. It's much more likely if somebody wants to use this chord, they'll write it as G7 with C in the bass. That's probably how I would write it the vast majority of the time. So speaking of slash chords, when we see a sus chord, there's a few different potential slash chords that we could substitute in our head, and it's really worth knowing these because a lot of composers, arrangers, chart writers will use these interchangeable. So a C sus is the same as B over C. So here's your just basic C sus. If I add the ninth, so B triad over C, very similar chord. B flat major 7, did I forget to say the flat? B flat over triad over C. B flat major 7 over C. I didn't write it down, it could be B flat 6 over C. Although if they want that, they'll probably write this next thing, which is G minor 7 over C. So I don't have this written down here, but no matter what kind of voicing you do, when you see a sus, you're simply going to replace the third with the fourth. So for instance, a common voicing I might use would be the third, the seventh, the ninth, and the fifth of a dominant chord. Pretty standard. I call this a type A voicing. A lot of jazz educators do. I'm not the one who came up with that. So if I want to change this from C dominant seventh to C sus, all I need to do is take this third, replace it with the fourth. Right, or let's say I have an F7, and I'm using this type B voicing. I've got the seventh, the third, the fifth, and the ninth. All I'm gonna do is I'm gonna replace the third with the fourth. And now I have a sus voicing. Okay, now in terms of improvising over this chord, moving on to number 4 here, using the Mixolydian mode, just like we would for a dominant seventh, is what we want to do. And this gets a little bit complicated because most people think that because we're avoiding the third in the chord, it means that we have to avoid the third as we're improvising. And as I've been told by many, many mentors, no, not at all. The chord is the chord, and then the scale just has to be something that sounds good against the chord. And in fact, I've had some really great jazz players tell me the third is kind of the sweetest note to play against a sus chord. So, okay, then I think it leads to a lot of confusion of like, so what's the difference in the end between a C7 and a C sus? And having that fourth instead of the third actually makes a lot of difference. 2 big points. The first one is that we don't have a tritone between the between the third and the seventh, right? If we have a normal dominant seventh chord, between the third and the seventh is a tritone, which means it really wants to resolve. The sus, especially if we take it out of context, doesn't have that, and so it feels very different than a dominant chord. It feels much more wide open, whereas this dominant chord, it's got a mission. It's got to get in, get out. The second thing is, when we have a dominant chord, 6 out of our 7 notes sound good against it in our scale, right? If I have this chord, these are good, but this one is problematic. For a sus chord, all 7 notes sound good. And this is one of the reasons why we love sus chords in modal contexts. You can think of Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage as such a great example of using sus chords, right? It starts D sus, and then goes to F sus, right? If this were dominant seventh chords, it would be really weird. It doesn't have that openness, and we would be much more constricted when we're improvising. So the sus, even though it uses the same mode as the dominant seventh chord, actually gives us more options in terms of improvising. One of the things that we can do back to being in a tonal context, is that we can use sus chords to ornament a 2-5-1. And you hear particularly pianists who are influenced by European classical music doing this. Keith Jarrett is the first example that comes to mind. So instead of, if I'm doing a 2-5-1, I'm going to play it with the blue chords now. Right. is to create a little bit of movement within a progression. How about at the end of Misty? Let's say. And notice that's a particularly interesting example because the melody is going the opposite way. It's going from the third to the fourth of the B flat 7 chord. But it actually works okay. Now, this red marking is definitely possible. Again, it's going to have a more classical sound to it. And you're going to have to resolve to a triad rather than to a major 7th chord. And oftentimes if I saw that, like as I'm trying to execute that, I'm probably not going to use the major 7th. I'm just going to have a sus triad. Like just C, sus, with no 7th. Maybe add the 9th. I'm gonna try to put them both in. Let's see if it's too much. Might be a little bit too much. How about on I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good? Here's a great place to use a sus. Pretty sure Keith does it there. So notice here I'm using a sus. I wasn't even thinking about it. Right, the chord should be. But instead, I'm just using a sus the whole 5 chord instead of resolving to the 3rd. So, if I were to put that in the G7, if I were to show you, it would just be the blue writing now. Okay. If this were classical music, right, this pattern of preparation, suspension, resolution, this would drive your theory professor crazy. Say, where's the resolution, right? If you don't resolve there, you're doing it wrong. But in jazz, it sounds okay. Now, if you were a very close watcher, you might have noticed that while I was holding that sus chord for I Got It Bad, I went from, let's call it a G sus 9 to, I'll erase all of this, a G sus flat 9. Which does give you some kind of a sense of resolution, even if you're not resolving the sus, which is really interesting, I think. Now, I didn't write it down here, so I'll write it down now. But let's take that G sus flat 9. We can also think of that in terms of kind of a slash chord. That's the word. It could be like D half diminished over G, F minor over G. Those are probably the two main ones we're going to think about. F minor 6, of course, is really going to be the same. Or even F minor 7 over G gives us something really interesting. Here's an F minor 7. And this is an interesting chord for a couple of reasons. I know that I often have students be like, I understand what to use almost all the modes with in terms of chords, but what about the Phrygian mode? Well, this sus 7 flat 9 is one place where you can use the Phrygian mode. So I know I'm switching keys here. I'm sorry. It's because I'm just off the cuff. But if I'm on a C sus flat 9, this is a great place to use C Phrygian. dark, very Spanish sounding, right? Very mysterious. On the right-hand side, I've given you a different mode in blue, which is the second mode, if I'm doing this right, of the melodic minor scale. So this is like B-flat melodic minor. And we can call this Phrygian raised 6. You might hear people call it Phrygian natural 6. I'm fine with either name. And so this is just like Phrygian, but you probably guessed from the name. You guys are smart. It's got a raised 6. So it's a little bit brighter than the Phrygian, right? And, I would say context would play the main role on which one I would choose. If I'm in the key of F minor, and this C sus flat 9 is functioning like the 5 chord, then I'd probably use Phrygian. Right? If I'm in kind of a modal context and we're going, just from one unusual chord to the next, then that's the time that I might choose the Phrygian raised 6. Or, better yet, if I'm in the key of F major, right? If we're doing something, if you're playing an introduction, this chord, this sus 7 flat 9, is a really nice chord for an introduction, right? Let's think, what's a good tune in F? What if I'm playing It Could Happen to You in F? We might play that in some different keys, but for an introduction, I might end up using this C sus 7 flat 9. It's got this feeling of suspension, for lack of any better word, or suspense. Cool. So I think that's what I wanted to tell you about sus chords today. Friendly reminders, CD is out. Songs of Rebirth by Jeremy Siskind. Anywhere you find music. Jazz Piano Fundamentals. Great book for your first 6 to 8 months of lessons of piano playing. Playing solo jazz piano, the definitive book on how to play solo jazz piano. I'll see you all around for some new videos soon.